Hello everyone and welcome to the channel ran by the guy who's run out of ideas and has decided to bust out old reliable iceberg charts. Today we're talking about the World War II mysterious iceberg. I think it should be known as the World War II mystery, conspiracy theory, and neat points of history iceberg, but that doesn't roll off the tongue as well. But hey, I thought it was really neat because if there's two things that I love, it's random things that happen throughout history and mysteries and conspiracy theories you can't tell me didn't happen. I found this iceberg off of icebergchart.com and it will be linked below if you want to follow along. And it's even color coded. How cool is that? I'll be using the color code to determine how I go through the chart, with whatever's got the least entries is going to go first and what has the most is going to go last. With the introduction out of the way, hey, thank you for watching, and let's talk about some of history's mysteries. Starting off the iceberg, we have Emperor Hirohito's involvement with war crimes during World War II. It's kind of overlooked for the most part because of, Germany, but Japan committed a lot of war crimes during World War II. Now, no one's absolved of sin. Everyone did it. Everyone is guilty of it. But Japan's were really bad. And I mean like really, really bad. After Japan had surrendered and everyone was going to trial for the atrocities committed, the emperor and his family were surprisingly never charged with anything, which brought up the debate of how responsible Emperor Hirohito is for his military's crime. It's mostly debated because no one's really sure how much power the emperor really had, and the US government contradicting itself. See, during the war itself, when the propaganda machine was running rampant and, the States was pushing out all of this information, they painted Hirohito to be just as powerful and evil as Hitler and Mussolini. But, then bombs were dropped, papers were signed, Japan had completely surrendered, and we began reconstruction for it, and now the nation is, anime land. Well, it's what we know today. The problem is that the US government really changed its tune from the emperor is all-powerful and rules the land to he's a figurehead with absolutely zero power who has nothing to do with the running of the government. It also didn't help that the Japanese government went along with this statement, which kind of contradicted Articles 4, 6, and 11 of the Constitutions, which state, quote, "The emperor is the head of the empire, combining in himself the rights of sovereignty and exercises with them according to the provisions of the present constitution. The emperor gives sanctions to laws and orders them to be promulgated and executed, and the emperor has the supreme command of the army and navy." Now, it's easy to determine the most likely reason that the US went with the story of the emperor having no power was because they knew that they needed to keep Emperor Hirohito alive and in power in order to reconstruct Japan smoothly and just kind of not have to deal with the people fighting because the emperor was going with it. But at the same time, Emperor Hirohito didn't get off completely scot-free, as he had to announce that he was Arahitogami, which means divine being, and it was the ending of the belief amongst the Japanese people that the emperor and his family were descendants of gods. So yeah, there's evidence on both sides saying whether he should or shouldn't have been charged. No one really knows definitely if he should have been. It's really based on how you interpret evidence. And since we're on the topic of Japanese war crimes and whether or not the imperial family was responsible for anything, we have the Nanjing Massacre, also known as something else, which I'm not gonna call it. This technically happened during the Sino-Japanese War, but that was happening at the same time as World War II, so it counts. It started shortly after the Imperial Army captured the city of Nanjing, which was China's capital at the time, and for the next 6 weeks or so, Japanese soldiers killed unarmed civilians, prisoners of war, they looted, and did other terrible, horrible things. And it's really the questions of, one, how bad was the incident itself, and two, who's to blame for it starting. It should be noted that there is a small, very, very small minority of people who outright deny it ever happened, but there is far too much evidence, including pictures, videos. Members of the Japanese army who were in Nanjing openly admitted that yes, this did happen, and the Japanese government admitting to it happening and apologizing several times for it over the years. Now, most scholars and historical records of the people who were there say the death toll was likely somewhere between 40,000 and 300,000. However, the Chinese government is adamant that at least 300,000 were massacred, and I mean, we all know how reliable the Chinese government is and how honest they are. To contradict that, the Japanese state that the city's population was only around 200,000, and that's mostly based off of their intel reports and the information they had on the city before they actually conquered it. As for who started it, it's heavily debated on whether or not the emperor's uncle, Princess Saka, is to blame for all of it. See, Princess Saka was the commanding officer during the siege of Nanjing, and in his orders, there was the explicit command to kill all prisoners. It's really not known if he wrote this himself, or if whoever was passing the word down to subordinates slipped it into the orders without him knowing. And yeah, it's not known whether or not he gave the explicit order. Once it started, he didn't exactly tell his men to stop. So that kind of paints him as guilty, if you ask me. It also didn't help that Emperor Hirohito signed paperwork in 1935 that said the Imperial Army didn't have to adhere to international law, so they could do things like killing unarmed prisoners and looting in already captured cities. So yeah, MIA soldiers is a pretty simple one. MIA stands for missing in action, and there are a lot of unaccounted troops from all sides of the war. Whether it be bodies that were never recovered from a battle, they were lost at sea, they just ran off and went into hiding. There's an unlimited number of things that could have happened. But at the end of the day, we don't know where they are or what happened to them. I couldn't find an overarching number for the total number of missing troops from World War II, but the US alone has over 78,000 and Germany has over 1 million unaccounted troops. And I'd imagine other countries have similar numbers of missing troops in between those two spans. So most people know the story of Anne Frank. She was a Jewish girl who hid in an attic during German occupation and wrote a diary about her life in the attic. Unfortunately, her and her family were caught and she passed away in a concentration camp shortly before the British soldiers liberated. Her father, who did survive the war, then decided to take her diary and publish it into a book. Well, technically 3 different versions of that book, but we're just gonna go with the 2. Anne initially kept the diary to document the lives of everyone in the attic, and that was turned into the Diary of Anne Frank as we know it. But there's also a second version where she kind of started adding and changing and removing things from it after she had heard a Dutch exile on the radio say he was looking for diaries and letters to turn into a book to publish. This is what gave her the idea of, not only should I double check and make sure everything is accurate, but it kind of gave her the inspiration of, well, maybe I should publish my own diary into a book. And because of these 2, technically 3 versions of the same story by the same person, there is argument on, well, was Anne ever real? And, well, yes, she was. She was a real person. It should also be known that this 3rd version is just kind of a combination of the 2, with Otto kind of omitting some things that didn't need to be in there. They're more of like personal things from like Anne just as a teenager that he just like, yeah, no one needs to read those, and they were justifiable things to remove. Next, we have the theory of Germans fleeing to Argentina, which is kind of an important one because a lot of other theories and mysteries actually wrap back around into this one. A little bit of context for this, most South American countries remained mostly neutral during the war, but they weren't exactly liking Germany or other Axis powers, whereas Argentina was very pro-Germany. They didn't have like that big of an issue with them. So as Germany started to fall apart in on itself, several high-ranking Germans knew Argentina wouldn't extradite them to allied countries. So once, everything started to fall apart completely, they began using what were known as rat lines that went from Germany to Spain and from there South America to escape. And this did actually work for quite a few high-ranking individuals. Well, we know this because both Adolf Eichmann and Joseph Mengele made it there, since Eichmann was captured in Argentina in 1960 and Mengele died in Brazil back in 1977. The big question is just how many people made it out of Germany, because we have a list of big name individuals that were found, but we don't have an entire list. And as far as I know, it's possible that big names such as Adolf Hitler, Mueller, and several others escaped as well. And just to add a little more gas to the flame, it's theorized that the town of Bariloche was built by Germans as a just-in-case safe haven in case everything fell apart during the war, because the city was built between 1935 and 1940, and not only was it built by Germans in general, the entire thing has traditional German architecture. It's just a random town in Argentina that looks like a small German village. It's actually a pretty decent series you can watch on Amazon that's known as Hunting Hitler. It's about a group of investigators trying to, looking to see which high-ranking Germans whose bodies were never actually identified post-war and were theorized to have escaped to South America actually made it there. And it's pretty interesting, so check that out if you want. So Heinrich Mueller was the head of the Gestapo, aka the German secret police, and one of the highest-ranking members of the Third Reich, and to this day, no one knows where he is. Heinrich was last seen May 1st, 1945 inside the secret bunker, and Hans Bauer, Hitler's personal pilot, claimed Mueller's last words before disappearing were, "We know the Russian methods exactly. I haven't the faintest intention of being taken prisoner by the Russians." And after that, he just completely vanished, never to be seen again. Now, there is some evidence that Mueller died during the fall of Berlin, and his body was never identified or just thrown into a mass grave, but there's also a lot of evidence to say the opposite. Since no body was ever identified as Mueller's, US and British intelligence began a massive manhunt for him, and they both came up empty. The big issues being they were searching in Europe, Heinrich Mueller was a very common German name, and there was another high-ranking member of the German government with the same name. No one was really having any luck finding the guy. Then, in the late 60s, when Eichmann was on trial in Israel, he claimed he never had contact with Mueller, but did believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was still alive and escaped Berlin, and Eichmann saying this kind of reignited the search. There are also reports that Mueller was able to flee to Moscow but was captured and killed in 1948, which makes no sense if you ask me. I mean, he was well aware of what the Russians would have done to him if he got found out, so it made no sense that he would run away to Russia. There's also a claim that in 1988, a leaked US Army counter-intel dossier stated that Mueller was picked up by the US and made an advisor for the counter-intel division of the US Army. There's no real validity to this as far as I know, aside from this one document that says that. There's also a theory, which I personally believe, that Mueller did make it to Argentina, and not only did he live out his days there and die, he is now buried in an unmarked grave somewhere near Bariloche. The Walbrzych gold train, or Nazi gold train, is a supposed train hidden by the Germans in southwestern Poland during the last days of World War II that's become a bit of an urban legend over the years. It's well known and kind of pretty decently documented that during the end of the war, most Germans realized, yeah, we're not going to win this. They started hiding national treasures. They started hiding personal wealth so that if they were able to escape, they could come back and get it later. It's believed that this train is one of those hidden treasures, and it's full of gold, priceless gems, and artwork. However, despite several searches over the years, no evidence of the train has ever been found. There's really not a lot of information on this, and as far as I know, the last search for the train was conducted around 2015, 2016, but nothing came up. So yeah, there may be a train full of gold hidden somewhere in Poland. And our last entry for Tier 1 is Die Glock, or the Bell, and it was a supposed secret science experiment by the Germans. It was supposedly conducted at a facility called Der Ries near the German-Czech border, and this is all going to really start sounding like Call of Duty Zombies lore, and that's because this whole conspiracy was kind of used as a basis for it. Die Glock was described as a device made out of hard, heavy metal approximately 9 feet wide and 12 to 15 feet tall, having a shape similar to a large bell, hence the name. It's also said that it used a metallic liquid known as Zerum 525 and supposedly looks something like this. And we don't really know if it was, one, if it was real, two, if it actually, what its purpose was. They think it had something to do with anti-gravity propulsion. There's also other theories saying that it used a red liquid, and when turned on, there was a mirror inside that you could use to look inside the past when the red liquid was flowing. Yeah. So the obvious questions are, was it real? And if so, where is it? And no one really knows. Supposedly, all the scientists working on the project were killed and thrown into a mass grave in an attempt to cover everything up. And it's speculated that if Die Glock is real and the Germans were able to get it out of its actual facility, it was either given to the US as a part of a deal with Hans Kammler, it was recovered as a part of the Kecksburg UFO crash, which is something we'll talk about later, or it was smuggled to South America, or maybe even Antarctica when higher-ranking Germans fled. And that's going to do it for Tier 1 of the World War II Mysterious Iceberg. If you liked the video, hey, glad you enjoyed it. Check out some of my other stuff. Thank you so much for watching. That's really cool of you. Alright, I'm gonna go now. Bye-bye. Love ya.